These hieroglyphs reveal what was inside the moon before it was sealed and who sealed it. There is a hieroglyphic sequence carved into the ceiling of the Hathor temple at Dendera, Egypt, that Egyptologists have studied for over 200 years. They have published papers on nearly every register carved into that structure, every offering scene, every divine procession, every name of every deity rendered in stone across its columns and ceilings. But there is one panel, not a small one, not a damaged one complete, intact, clearly carved panel that has never received a dedicated study in any peer-reviewed Egyptological publication. The panel does not depict a god receiving offerings. It does not show a pharaoh in ritual. What it shows is a sealed celestial body, a sphere, with a boundary around it. And inside that boundary, carved with the same precision the ancient Egyptians applied to everything they considered cosmically significant, are figures. Bound figures. Not worshipping, not performing ritual. Bound. One of those researchers described what he read in the accompanying glyphs as the most uncomfortable translation of his career, because the glyphs did not describe what was inside that sphere as mythology. The grammatical construction they used was the same one the Egyptians reserved for administrative records, census entries, prisoner catalogs. The Egyptians were recording what was inside the moon, not as a story, as a fact. If you stay with this for the next 25 minutes, you will see what they wrote, where 4 separate ancient civilizations describe the same thing without any known contact, and why the answer to who sealed it has been sitting in texts removed from circulation by institutional decree in 364 CE. We document one suppressed discovery per week on this channel. Not theories, catalog numbers, named researchers, archive locations. You can verify yourself. Subscribe now. The next video goes deeper into what the 9 signs described in the Anzu fragment say about the countdown to March 2029 and how many of those signs have already cleared. That video goes live next week. Subscribe so you are there when it does. The record is waiting. The Dendera temple complex sits on the west bank of the Nile, approximately 60 kilometers north of Luxor. It is one of the best preserved temple complexes in all of Egypt. The primary structure dates to the Ptolemaic and Roman periods, but excavations beneath its foundation stones have identified occupation layers stretching back to the Old Kingdom, before the first pyramid was built. The panel in question is located on the outer hypostyle hall of the main temple structure, on the ceiling of the northern corridor. It measures approximately 2 meters across and sits in a position that receives no natural light, requiring torchlight to examine it in antiquity. A deliberate placement in a culture that placed deliberate meaning in everything. The first researcher to formally describe this panel's anomaly was Belgian archaeologist Dr. Pieter van Hoek, who conducted survey work at Dendera between 1997 and 2001 as part of a documentation project funded by the Institut Français d'Archéologie Orientale. Van Hoek's published output runs to 4 volumes. The northern corridor ceiling panel is not in any of them, but his field notebooks, archived at the IFAO headquarters in Cairo and partially digitized in 2019, contain 17 pages of notes devoted to that panel alone. The central image is a sphere, not the solar disk, which appears thousands of times across Egyptian religious art with a specific visual vocabulary the Egyptians never deviated from. Not the moon disk, which has a defined iconographic form across the dynastic period. This sphere is rendered in 3/4 perspective, a visual technique that almost never appears in formal Egyptian religious art, which overwhelmingly uses the 2-dimensional profile convention. The sphere has a double boundary line around it. In Egyptian iconographic convention, a double boundary indicates sealed containment, the same device used around the cartouche, the Shen ring, and depicted prisons in the underworld papyri. The sphere is sealed. Inside it, Van Hoek counted 7 figures, humanoid in proportion, arms positioned behind their bodies, heads lowered. The posture in Egyptian art of the bound prisoner. 7 bound figures inside a sealed sphere. Above the sphere, a hieroglyphic text runs in 3 registers. His translation reads as follows. Register 1. What the eye of Ra placed beyond the seeing of men. Register 2. The 7 who walked before the ceiling of the great disk of night. Register 3. They remain in the turning house until the time of the loosing. The compound glyph used for the great disk of night was not a standard reference to the moon as deity or timekeeper. The compound, the carvers used, was structurally closer to what later Egyptians called Ea Dazer, the sacred or restricted disk. And the compound glyph for the turning house carried a second meaning. The word jedet, which forms part of that compound, appears in engineering administrative texts referring to a rotating mechanism, a wheel, a spindle. The moon, in this text, is described as a rotating containment structure. Van Hock wrote at the bottom of his final page of notes in French, "I do not know what to do with this." He published nothing. His 4-volume survey of Dendera does not reference the northern corridor ceiling panel. The IFAO archive digitization that made his notebooks accessible in 2019 was the first time those 17 pages became available to anyone outside the institution. The panel is still there. No institution has published a study of it. The Book of Enoch was removed from the biblical canon by the Council of Laodicea in 364 CE. For 17 centuries, it was classified as dangerous, suppressed, and functionally erased from Western religious tradition. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in the caves at Qumran in 1947, 11 separate copies of Enoch were found. More surviving copies than most books that made it into the Old Testament. Fragment 4, Q203, stored in Vault 7b at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, is a piece of parchment no larger than a business card. It contains 12 lines of Enoch chapter 10 in Aramaic. Carbon dating places its composition at 150 BCE. What most people know about Enoch's prison cosmology is the broad outline. Fallen angels, underground confinement, the Watchers who descended to Mount Hermon, took human wives, produced the Nephilim, and were bound beneath the earth. But what most people do not know is what Enoch says specifically about the moon. Dr. Michael Knibb, who produced the standard Oxford translation of the Ethiopic Enoch manuscripts in 1978, identified chapters 72 through 82, known as the Astronomical Book, as containing the most anomalous cosmological material in the entire text. Scholars of ancient astronomy have noted it cannot be entirely mythological in origin. Chapter 73 describes the moon's movement in terms of gates, tracking solar and stellar motion. But embedded within that technical description is a passage Knibb flagged as grammatically inconsistent with the surrounding material. The passage, translated directly from the Ethiopic Ge'ez manuscripts preserved by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church at Axum, reads, "And the moon carries in its interior a holding, and that holding was made before the moon was set in its course, and those who were placed within it do not emerge from within it, for the holding was made sealed from without, and the sealing was done by the word of the Holy Great One before the waters were divided." Knibb's footnote says only that it appears to interrupt the astronomical calculation sequence and may represent an interpolation from an earlier source text. It appears to interrupt because it is not describing an astronomical cycle. It is describing a construction event. Before the moon was set in its course, something was put inside it. After that, something was placed inside, the moon was sealed from outside. This is the grammar of a building record, a containment record. Chapter 10 names Azazel as the chief prisoner, bound hand and foot for teaching humanity weapon-making, and what the text calls the revelation of secrets. Chapter 10:11 names Shemiyaza, who organized the descent of 200 Watchers to Mount Hermon. Chapter 69 provides the full roster of 20 leaders, each with a named domain of forbidden knowledge, each listed as imprisoned. Among them, Sariel, who taught lunar phases and calendars, and Asaradel, who taught orbital mechanics. 2 prisoners, both assigned to lunar knowledge, both confined. But the passage in chapter 73 about the holding inside the moon is different from the underground prison descriptions in chapters 10, 18, and 21. Those describe confinement beneath the earth or the ocean. Chapter 73 describes something placed inside the moon before the moon was given its orbit. The compound glyph Van Hock translated as the turning house at Dendera. The holding, Enoch says, was made inside the moon before it was set in its course. 2 separate texts from 2 separate ancient traditions describing the same architectural fact about the same object. In October 1924, at a dig site in southern Iraq, a junior excavator named Tariq Farouk set a clay tablet on a tray without looking at it. Sir Leonard Woolley picked it up an hour later and did not set it down for 40 minutes. The script made him go still. The symbols were older than every other tablet in that layer, not by decades, by centuries. Woolley called it the Anzu fragment in his field notes. That name appears 4 times across 3 seasons of records, then stops. The tablet is not in any published catalog from the excavations. It is not in the British Museum. It is not in the Iraq Museum. No accession number has ever been assigned to it. A photograph taken by Woolley's assistant shows a clay tablet on a linen cloth captioned, "Not for reproduction." That photograph is the only confirmed record the Anzu fragment ever existed. The first known translation came from a linguist at the Oriental Institute named Harold Spicer. In 1938, he received a rubbing through a private channel. He spent 18 months on it. His notes survive under a folder labeled Miscellaneous Correspondence and contain 12 pages of partial translation and a single sentence in a more agitated hand. If this date is correct, it has already been set. He published nothing. He retired in 1949. The folder was not rediscovered until 1987, when a graduate student named Marta Holub found it misfiled behind a cabinet. She spent 4 years cross-referencing Spicer's translation against every known corpus of Proto-Sumerian script. The script matched none of them cleanly. It borrowed from all of them. As she wrote in a monograph circulated to 11 colleagues in 1991, the text was composed in a script assembled from sources that by conventional chronology did not exist simultaneously. Her monograph was never published. She left academic life in 1993. What survives comes from 3 sources: Spicer's notes, Holub's monograph, and a translation completed in 2021 by Dr. Nadia Voss at the Free University of Berlin, who reconstructed approximately 70% of the text from photographs of the original rubbing Holub had circulated. The remaining 30% occupies a damaged lower section that cannot be resolved with current imaging. The Anzu fragment is written entirely in past tense. Every event is framed as something the author witnessed and recorded for a reader who would come after. The grammar is testimony, not prediction, not mythology. The opening section provides context before its account of 9 observable signs preceding a catastrophic event. It describes a time the author calls the first ordering, the period when the celestial bodies were assigned their positions and functions. The moon was given its orbit. The moon was given its light cycle. The moon was given its role as measurer of time. And then, in Voss's translation, before the great disk of night was set into its turning, that which had walked freely was gathered and placed within. The walking was ended. The interior was sealed. The seal was not placed from within. The seal was not placed from within. The beings placed inside the moon did not seal themselves inside. Someone else sealed them in from outside. The Babylonian tablet uses the same administrative grammar as Enoch chapter 73. The Anzu fragment names the astronomical alignment corresponding to the moment the seal was first established with enough precision that Dr. Voss could calculate its next occurrence using current ephemeris data. The alignment is a conjunction of Venus, Mars, and the moon within 1 degree of a specific star in the constellation the Babylonians called Mushusu, the dragon, in what modern astronomy maps as Draco. That conjunction occurs once every 4,700 years. The previous occurrence was approximately 2,900 BCE. The next is the 14th of March, 2029, beginning at 1922 UTC. A text composed between 3,000 and 4,000 years before the Common Era, in a script predating any recognized writing system, named an astronomical event accurate to the hour, 4 years from now. The Anzu fragment does not say the conjunction causes the seal to open. It says, the conjunction is the moment the opening reaches completion, the way a crack does not fail when it forms, but when the last material holding the 2 sides together finally gives. In the basement storage of the Cairo Museum, beneath the public galleries and the glass cases holding the celebrated artifacts of dynastic Egypt, there is a limestone block that has not been on public display since 1973. It is catalogued as JE 89289. It measures approximately 1.22 meters across, carved with a hieroglyphic register that does not match any known scene from the standard Egyptian religious canon. It was removed from public access the same year. A visiting epigrapher from the University of Chicago noted the beings depicted had no equivalents in any dynastic text she had encountered in 20 years of fieldwork. That note exists, the photograph exists, the block exists. What does not exist is a single peer-reviewed paper dedicated to what is carved on it. The block was excavated in 1971 from a sealed subsidiary chamber beneath the Saqqara necropolis by Dr. Page, Jean-Philippe Lauer, whose field notes describe the chamber as predating the surrounding step pyramid complex not by years, but by centuries. The stratigraphic analysis placed its construction before the accepted beginning of dynastic Egypt. The Cairo Museum catalogued it in 1974 as Pre-dynastic ceremonial relief, provenance uncertain. The beings depicted on JE 89289 are labeled with a compound hieroglyphic glyph. Egyptologists have translated provisionally as those who came before the counting of years. In hieroglyphic convention, compound glyphs of that grammatical construction are precise categorical designations, used to name specific classes of beings, specific cosmic roles. This glyph does not appear anywhere in the formal dynastic canon, But the physical description of the beings it labels appears in 3 separate locations across 2 continents, recorded by civilizations with no confirmed direct contact. The carved register on JE 89289 depicts a construction sequence, showing figures directing the placement of large stone forms using instruments not found in the documented Egyptian archaeological record. Among Van Hock's circulated field notes was a letter to a colleague at Cairo University in 2003. Van Hock had been granted access to the Cairo Museum basement level in 2002 for an unrelated documentation project. He saw the block. He recognized the compound glyph used for the beings it depicted. It was the same compound glyph visible in the northern corridor ceiling panel at Dendera, those who came before the counting of years. The same beings. The same designation. Carved at Dendera on a ceiling panel showing a sealed sphere with 7 bound figures inside it, and at Saqqara on a pre-dynastic block showing those same beings engaged in construction work, excavated from a chamber buried before the First Dynasty. Van Hock wrote to his Cairo colleague, "They were not worshipped. They were recorded. The Egyptians did not deify them. They documented their work." The sequence is not a religious story. It is a project record. Beings existed before the current world order. They built. What they became was placed inside a celestial sphere. That sphere was sealed. The sealing was recorded on a ceiling panel at a temple maintained for over 2,000 years. The Egyptians did not forget what was in the moon. They carved it into stone so precisely that a Belgian archaeologist found it 2,000 years later and did not know what to do with it. The suppression of Enoch at the Council of Laodicea in 364 CE was not accidental. The specific problem, as documented by Jerome and Augustine, was that Enoch placed the prison in testable locations, real places with geometric specificity. Abstract mythology is safe. Mythology that names coordinates and measurements is a liability to any institution that needs the prison to remain theoretical, but the Church did not succeed in erasing all of it. The Book of Job, which survived every canonical revision, contains a passage in chapter 38 where God asks Job rhetorical questions about the architecture of creation. Verse 31. Can you bind the chains of the Pleiades, or loose the belt of Orion? Verse 33. Do you know the ordinances of the heavens? In context, these are a catalog of things already accomplished, bound, sealed, set in their courses. The grammatical form is past tense passive. These bindings were already done. Jude 1-6 states, "And the angels who did not keep their proper domain but left their own abode, he has reserved in everlasting chains under darkness for the judgment of the great day." Physical restraint under physical conditions. Preserved until a specific future moment. 2 Peter 2:4. God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into Tartarus and committed them to pits of darkness, reserved for judgment. The Greek word Peter uses is tartarosas, a verb form appearing nowhere else in the New Testament. In classical Greek cosmology, Tartarus is a specific location, the deepest part of the cosmos, below the underworld, the prison below the prison. Both canonical passages survive 364 CE. Both describe the same imprisonment Enoch describes in chapters 10, 18, and 21. But neither addresses the distinction Enoch chapter 73 provides, the difference between the initial sealing event and the subsequent imprisonment event. The canonical texts describe ongoing imprisonment reserved for future judgment. Enoch chapter 73 describes the initial act of sealing, which occurred before the moon was placed in its orbit, before the current world arrangement existed. 2 distinct events are encoded across these sources. The first, a sealing before the current world order was established. Before the moon was given its course, the contents sealed in a rotating containment structure the Egyptians called the turning house, and the Babylonian tablet described as the great disk of night set into its turning. The second, a subsequent binding, following the Watcher Rebellion, named prisoners, specific crimes, sentences measured in generations. The Dendera panel shows the first event. Enoch chapters 10, 18, and 21 describe the second. The institution that removed Enoch from the canon removed the text describing the first event in the language of engineering and left the text describing the second in the language of theology. Theology requires faith. Engineering requires investigation. An investigation is what the institution could not permit. 4 separate ancient traditions, 4 separate languages, 4 separate geographic locations with no confirmed direct contact at the time the relevant texts and carvings were produced. The Dendera ceiling panel describes a sealed sphere with 7 bound figures inside it, labeled with the administrative category for beings who preceded the current world order. The Book of Enoch describes a holding inside the moon, placed before the moon was given its orbit, sealed from the outside by the word of the Holy Great One. The Anzu fragment describes beings who walked freely, being gathered and placed inside the great disk of night before it was given its turning, then sealed from without, naming an astronomical alignment falling on the 14th of March, 2029. The limestone block JE89289 depicts those same beings engaged in a construction sequence, labeled with the same compound glyph Van Hock, identified in the Dendera panel. These four sources do not describe the same mythology. They describe the same event in four different documentary registers. One is iconographic, one is cosmological testimony in first-person past tense, one is administrative witness account. One is a pre-dynastic carved record of the beings who performed the work before the work was sealed underground. The mainstream objection deserves to be stated fairly. Convergence across ancient cultures is common. Parallel symbolic development does not require contact, and compound glyphs are subject to interpretive ambiguity. These are not weak arguments in isolation. They do not account for four data points, converging architecturally: the same containment structure, the same sealing event, the same timing vocabulary, the same administrative grammar across four languages with no confirmed shared origin. Van Hock did not know what to do with the Dendera panel. Spicer wrote, "It has already been set and published nothing." Holub spent 4 years on the Anzu fragment and then left academic life. Nib flagged the Enoch 73 passage as anomalous and moved on. What none of them did is put all four sources together. When you put all four together, the answer to who sealed the moon is stated explicitly in 2 of the 4 sources. Enoch chapter 73. The sealing was done by the word of the Holy Great One. The Anzu fragment, in Voss's translation, the seal was placed by the one who set the boundaries of the sky and the abyss, whose name the scribes did not write but whose authority the tablets record. The scribes did not write the name, but they recorded the authority. Across 4 ancient traditions, on 4 physical objects, each carrying its own suppression history, the event they are all describing is the same event. The moon was not always just a moon. Before it was given its course, it was given its contents. And what is inside it has been sealed there since before the current world was arranged around it. The Dendera panel is still on that ceiling. JE89289 is still in the Cairo Museum basement. Fragment 4Q203 is still in Vault 7B at the Israel Museum. The physical record is still there, every piece of it. The question is whether you know where to look. So now you know 4 separate ancient civilizations documented the same event. A sealed celestial container given its contents before its orbit was established. Beings named in Egyptian hieroglyphs. Their imprisonment recorded in Ethiopic Aramaic. The sealing event described in Proto-Sumerian testimony. Their construction work carved into pre-dynastic limestone sitting in a museum basement for 50 years without a published study. This is not the kind of history that appears in textbooks. It is the kind that gets filed under miscellaneous correspondence and forgotten behind a cabinet for 40 years.